delay, so we are dialing up to Nangchen, Eastern Tibet, the Tibetan Plateau in present-day Qinghai province. We have Wangdrak Rinpoche, Gebchak Wangdrak Rinpoche on the phone here with us. Rinpoche, chila ngotu de sashuna.
Oh yeah, that's like a doggy don't know that to the doggy jora. Didn't you less out that here you have order. Didn't not you supported by come Nancy. Any Gebchak go be supported. Tanga you. Then Aran Titon Ticket to go in on it, and it's when we check a homa. Gebchak Tanya Jason, the next Halata Charlie. Gebchak go back at the took anything a mailer, and they want to go. So you meet other Gebchak go back at the
So Rinpoche is living near Gebchak Nunnery, locally known as Gebchak Gompa, which was founded in 1892 by a yogic disciple of the first Tsoknyi Rinpoche. The Gebchak Wangdrak Rinpoche here is a lama from Gebchak Nunnery, and that's where he's living now, looking after that nunnery. Lesser Rinpoche. So our first Lesser Rinpoche.
Gebchak Gompa, the Moju, Kenyani Siki Jeda, Dina, the Sanga, Franjo Nimawa, Dina, the Salon, there's a Tatrakatini, Yani Siki Topsi, the Salon of the Yani Siki, what the Dati Gompa JB, that they don't know, Jane.
So, in brief, Gebchak Nunnery is a community of mainly female practitioners, full-time practicing Vajrayana practices of the Nyingma tradition and within the Dzogchen meditation system. And they are specialists at Salung, or prana and nadi practices, yogic practices.
Malaysia which is the Chickijaka, which is the current city. And it's on up to the Pony. Chick Corazon, the Chickisha, the Sanga Dorje Takasariate, Yacham, things supported the less how much you're going to check. I Yarani, Takarani, Chile, how come? Yes, sure. She had Puya Bata. Into your Bata, what is our Mari?
And Rinpoche has been asked a few questions about Vajrayana practices for the conference here, but generally Vajrayana is a really vast and profound subject matter, and it's not so easy just to talk about in a normal conversational way, especially not in person like this. That's our Rinpoche.
Missing a couple of to two, you don't watch a golden mato, can much at the John Latinana, you want to don't know what she said at the yet where your mother. Yet I can't pound our change. Less how would you go and can't pound our change. And I see that the Raji, she look at Shakin over you.
And so to talk about the practice methods of Vajrayana and how they differ from more exoteric Buddhist practices, and then the Ta, Lung, and Tigli, or the prana, nadi, and bindu, the subtle body constituents that it entails, there's a lot that needs to be covered and explained to get to any point of the Vajrayana. So it's challenging, but Rinpoche here in a short period of time will do his best to explain things. So as far as Rinpoche has learned over his life as a monk and a Buddhist practitioner, the earliest Buddhist history of Tibet is originated with this quasi-historical figure Padmasambhava from India and other people who trained and translated Buddhism from India to Tibet. Lesser Rinpoche. And then over centuries, quite a lot of Tibetans traveled to India and studied and trained in the practices with Indian Buddhist, Vajrayana masters of India, and then very methodically translated a lot of the Buddhist scriptures into Tibetan language and transmitted it into Tibet that way. That's the Rinpoche. And until now, these lineages are a continuum of practice from in communities in Tibet is continued until today without break. So generally in the Tibetan tradition, one would begin their Vajrayana training with study, learning the philosophy and the basic principles of the Buddhist teachings. Once they've finished their, accomplished a level of study, then they would always rely on the personalized instructions of a qualified lama. So the mengak, which is the pith experiential instructions given by a qualified lama or teacher. And so menga in Tibetan or Upadesha, this style of teaching is it's an experiential, it's a sharing of experience from one qualified practitioner or teacher to another practitioner. So this style of pith, personalized instruction, is really trying to transmit that very heart experiential essence of knowledge from one person to another. So it's considered that the kind of supreme method of the Vajrayana in Tibet is that personalized transmission of knowledge through the experience of one lama to a practitioner. Lesser Rinpoche. Then it's with Tambodi. So the first question is just about some of the big differences between the Vajrayana practice methods and the practice methods of exoteric, more general Buddhism. So there's a lot that could be said, but in brief, Rinpoche will give some ideas here. Lesser Rinpoche. And so the goals of the Vajrayana are common, the cognitive or the ultimate goals of the Vajrayana are common with the goals of other Buddhist traditions, generally speaking. So some Buddhist traditions maybe have a goal of reaching a pure land, others maybe to transform the body, to purify the body and that sort of thing. But the final or the more ultimate goal of all Buddhist traditions is to realize to know the nature of reality as it is now, without obscuration. So sometimes enlightenment in the Buddhist tradition is described as Buddhahood, the state of Buddhahood, or realizing oneself as a deity and so forth. These are just descriptive. What the real goal is to completely know, to completely realize the nature of reality as it is now, without any confusion or obscuration. A full knowing of reality as it is the meaning of enlightenment in Buddhism. Chibar di Mari. So sometimes we might observe, like the Theravadan type of practice, a lot of shamatha and vipassana styles of meditation, where it's, the eyes are even slightly closed and the body and the mind seems to be very relaxed and calming. Whereas the Vajrayana methods are more about creative visualization of a deity and more energetic. But that level of difference is not what it really comes down to. So it might look like the Vajrayana practices are trying to attain, trying to become a deity, trying to create oneself as a deity. Maybe sometimes deities with 3 heads and all of these different features, wrathful deities and so forth. But it's not actually, that's not what is meant. That's not what's happening in the Vajrayana deity practice. Right, so the deity practice in Tibetan Buddhism or in Vajrayana, it's just an external creative method to attain that cognitive goal. So like in the Theravadan or the exoteric schools of Buddhism, one is meditating in Vipassana, for example, to realize the nature of reality as impermanent, impure, or subject to decomposition, and selfless, and suffering, and so forth, in order to realize the emptiness. Lhasa Rinpoche. Really simply, like a really simple comparison is in the Vipassana style of practice, like a Theravadan approach, one is trying to realize the impermanence of the nature of reality, and one is told to observe the impermanent nature. Whereas in the Vajrayana, one is told to observe the divine nature, the nature as a deity. So in the Theravada, feelings and sensations one is taught to recognize them as suffering, as dukkha. In the Vajrayana, one is told to recognize the very essence of those sensations and emotions as bliss or ecstasy. When it comes to emotions like attachment and aversion and ignorance and jealousy and pride, these negative emotions that in general Buddhist traditions, one is trying to shun them, to overcome them, to get rid of those negative emotions. But in the Vajrayana, one is not trying to get rid of the negative emotions, but to almost transmute the very essence of those emotions. So we're not trying to overcome them or get rid of them. It's really the very essence of those emotions that is worked with.
Then more time get Dagua is. More time get Chata Dagua is. Madaba Yomaris, knowing the whole because of the test like a penny, you talk about Madaba, Madaba, Mobuji Hindra. It is not this is him, Chura Tadarani, Chura Tabaras, Chura Jitudas, Chura send the Tabaras, Chura the Devaras, Chura Tabara, Jitudas, that is on the motor.
And then again, there's an emphasis in the like southern schools of Buddhism or the Theravada school of the impurity of the aggregates of a human being. But in the Vajrayana, that's not told so often. Rather, one is told that you're pure, that now, from the beginning, one's nature is pure, and to recognize that primordial purity of one's being.
And
So we might hear that the point is to recognize the nature of reality as it is. Well, what is this nature of reality that's being talked about here? What does that mean? So what's going on is that between the subject and the object, there's some obscuration somewhere in between the subject and the object. There's like some veil or obscuration that prevents one from knowing the nature of reality as it is. Awesome. So the issue is this mental consciousness, human mental consciousness is always knowing, conceptually, it's always this or that, or is not. If it is something, it is not something else. If it's this, it's not that. Like the conceptual mind always knows things in a dualistic way. And so, for example, if Rinpoche here is looking out at a white building across the street, but he puts on sunglasses, then it won't appear white to him. It's obscured with the color. So one way or another, our minds are conceptually obscured from knowing fully the nature of reality as it is. And to know it as it is the goal, the cognitive goal of Vajrayana practices overall. So generally we can say, even like in a lot of knowledge systems imparted in the world today, the idea of emptiness, like a deconstruction of reality, it's actually something that is quite common. We're able to talk about it and even intellectually comprehend it. But to really realize that experientially is something that's not happening. So in the Vajrayana practice system, you have the two stages, generation stage and completion stage. Mm-hmm. And the generation stage, which is that creative visualization of the tantric deity, so this functions to psychologically because ordinarily we identify as this ordinary human being, and there's low self-esteem and not knowing oneself and all kinds of obscurations into how we know, maybe sort of patterns, conditioned patterns. So the generation stage or the deity yoga is functioning on the principle of emptiness, so that self isn't actually truly existing. So anything is possible, and so one is identifying as divine. So that ordinary self doesn't truly exist, that one is divine, and one is kind of cutting through by identifying as the deity. And likewise, even in the world around us, we can, on the principle of emptiness, we understand that anything is possible. And so through that creative visualization, we're working with that principle of potential. So, everybody's got it to some extent, this impure view of oneself as a human being, feelings of limitation, low self-esteem, or just conditioned patterns of limitation that we put on ourselves. We don't believe in ourselves. And so through this practice, the truth is that there's no basis for that. If we really analyze, yes, the body is made of flesh and blood, but if you deconstruct all of it, it is this emptiness.
Oh.
So the way we experience ourselves now is based on a false, conceptual projection of ourselves. So this practice then just turns that around so that one can relate to that primordial emptiness or purity and identify with that purity, which is, So that's the generation stage. So the Tibetans would visualize, divinity in their own way, or the kind of ideal human in their own way. But Westerners might see it. Any example of kind of the greatest human being that you can imagine would work in the same way. So now it comes to the completion stage. That second stage of the Vajrayana is the completion stage. So when it comes to completion stage, there's completion stage, a conceptual kind of completion stage, one that involves literally signs, but one that involves thinking concepts, and one that is non-conceptual. So the first, the completion stage with signs involves the subtle body elements of Ta, Lung, and Tigli, or Prana, Nadi, and Bindu. In the completion stage, so you've got your Ta, Lung, and Tigli. So Ta is like these psychic channels in the body, subtle body channels. And Lung is kind of the energy of the winds. And then the Tigle is this essential drops, or Bindu in Sanskrit. So it's said that the Tsa, the channels are like the support. And then Rinpoche said, Joshi Sangachi, then he tempa Tigle sayadi?
Tempa Tigle Gitzoran, you are long Gitzoran.
So the completion stage, so that which moves is the lung, is the wind. That which is the basis is the channels, and that which relies is the Tigle. That's a Joshi Sangachi.
That sola, and it part Jarondi, and I took it the water Sena, and it took a longer, took a sonnet in it, and it jumped on the speed.
So when it comes to the religious terms that they would use in Tibet, they would say these three correlate to the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya, which are the three bodies of an enlightened Buddha. But these three, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya, these are coming down to the empty, cognizant, and creative nature, very nature reality. So the emptiness, the cognizance, it's empty but it knows, it's cognizant, and experience is unimpeded, like there's a constant appearance, constant flow of experience. So when it comes to the Vajrayana, the philosophical idea of interdependent arising, it's crucial. It's the most crucial kind of view that Vajrayana depends on, is the interdependent arising of all phenomena. Last term, which is salung titling after bena sile da which bena nupa stupo korangi sile energy da which is So the interdependent view of the Vajrayana is that the outer environment in which we live and the people that live there, the beings that live there, are profoundly interdependent. So the environment and the health of the environment affects the health, the mental and physical health of the people. So the interdependence of the outer and the inner, the outer world and the inner being that's interdependent. That those two can't be separated in the view of Vajrayana. So the material elements that the outer world are made of are the same elements that the human being is made of. So why are these Tibetans doing practice of the Tsa Lung yoga? So of course we've got like Hatha style yoga that's very popular around the world, and everybody's doing a lot of physical asana and yogic practice. But what the Tibetan Vajrayana practitioners are doing with their subtle body is quite different. Yeah, so the Hatha yoga that's very popular in the world is very beneficial for our bodies, to be sure.
Naso ka nanchu ke yoga te, naran so ka tapasanga dorje thakpa ke tini tsalon sangkorte, setel the lakpa yuya dan, si alo jaya dan, tes yuya thaya te na, seni te na dawo ji yure te, nani, pen mesi ka khaare te yure.
So in Vajrayana in Tibet, they have Salung and it's accompanying Tukor. So Tukor is a kind of hatha yoga. So it might look like they're doing these forceful sort of physical postures and movements, and it might look very similar to other kinds of hatha yoga, but actually the purpose and what's happening internally is quite different. The orientation is very different. And so from the perspective of how yoga functions in Vajrayana, the kind of hatha yoga that people are using just for their physical bodies, it's like using, golden tissue to wipe your arse with. It's a waste of a really golden technique. And the reason is, the problem there is that often popular Western forms of yoga is still embedded in this view that mind and matter, body and mind are different. So that profound, interdependence of mind and body and the subtle body elements of Salung and Tigli, those don't fit in that popular approach to yoga, that physical approach to yoga. So how is it that the yogic practices of Tsa and Lung in Tibet are functioning to attain wisdom? Like, how are they getting this non-dual awareness of reality? How are they functioning? So we've got practices like shamatha and vipassana, these calm abiding, very relaxation style of meditations that are, analyzing the nature of reality. Whereas the Tsalung yoga, it's manipulating, it's like this sort of forceful, using the mind and body. It's manipulating the energies, the mind-body energies of the body to facilitate that non-dual awareness or wisdom. So Dulu ginalo la kozupa ginalo la kampa dang la pa yorebe. Yo mare. Anyway, there's some example which is giving. So apparently there's a traditional analogy in Tibet where they say, like a snake, if you just look at a snake, we can't obviously see any hands and feet on a snake, but if you tie a snake in a knot, suddenly it's sort of, its members, you can see some kind of arms and legs from the inside of a snake. But anyway, I wasn't sure about that one, that example. Rinpoche's never seen it for himself. He's heard the example. Anyway. Maybe to the scientists listening to this, it doesn't make much sense.
Yenaya, Oma can Nana Mario, Oma the Toko Yapo Madana, Marta Monova, Anna Yingara, so the Secretary, long periods of the such as a Ghana, long dinner the Tanko Yuri, long the Ghana, Ghana, period. Long that period last of what I did, Haman and Kotu with the Piki, what you want, Benefit by Secretary, that is like a later food, half a total on a PC and my secretary, Deva, what Deva, Yimba, and what Deva, and Toba, they don't get in this maybe she hang around for you about it. The more that you're not chat you, nobody about it, they don't issue the chat of you.
So another maybe better example would be in milk and full cream milk, there's butter. You know, butter is there. If it just needs to be churned. If the milk is churned, butter comes out. That's for sure. So likewise, the Salung Yoga is functioning to manipulate the lung, to manipulate the mental consciousness and the energies of the mind body, to bring about that inherent, innate, non-dual awareness. And that non-dual awareness is then experienced as energetic. They say bliss and emptiness. It's a union of bliss and emptiness, which yeah. So it's an empty. It's felt, but it's empty. No, so. So a lot of people have heard nowadays of Tumo. So when we talk about Salung Yoga, it's kind of the same thing. It's the same thing as Tumo. Tumo is its fully fledged form. So when Tumo practitioners dry off a wet sheet, a lot of people have heard about this nowadays, and we think that that's the point, being able to have heat to dry off the wet sheet, that's the point. But actually, that's not the point of the practice at all. Then Rinpoche chirang Gebchak Wangdrak Rinpoche Benatua any desikali shuring whiching inji part shua. So then the second big question that's asked of Rinpoche here is in Eastern Tibet, like especially where the practice lineages are based, so the Kagyu and Nyingma, how is Vajrayana practiced? So typically, like, would people be doing a 3-year retreat? How many 3-year retreats? If you're doing like the 6 yogas of Naropa, for example, in what order would you be training in Tibet? Then Rinpoche pure Kongjin Jong Blackpart to come chotla. Then it Ju Tamchegi, Gorim Drikshigi, Gorim Kandriyume, Sangat Dojitepan Yamlenda.
The name is comes on the Sangha Dojitepan Yami, Shibana, Lama Tini de Bajita, in the Chita, Long, and Mengaya, which is your one for sure. That throws in it, Tambo, Hundroni, Ajo, the Tene, Hundroni, Asa, the Pesacatene, a Yadam can never start if you want it. Law from Dawa from Yama from the Lituan and your Chatan. I don't know the someone from California. Ola Pato is at in on the scene. That don't see you. I'm trying to let you go and don't it. Yamis in the Janu and Yamis by the Yuri. That they Koran hacking them, then it's the Mari, Charicha Samari.
So generally speaking, where Rinpoche is from in Tibet, and always the practitioner would begin by finding a reliable teacher and receiving those pith instructions, the mengak, those pith experiential instructions from a qualified teacher. Then one would do the preliminary practices called mundro, which is sort of psychologically preparing the mind and body for the more profound practices. And then one would continue doing a lot of accumulation of a yidam, so visualizing a tantric deity with its mantra, accumulating the mantra of a tantric deity. And then most people would do a 3-year, 3-month retreat in an enclosed retreat center. And in that 3-year, 3-month retreat, people would be getting some experience of the higher tantric yogas, like, for example, the 6 yogas of Naropa. So the Tsalung practices like Tumo, some dream yoga, and so forth. And then there's every now and then you have people that are just yogis in mountains, living in caves and sort of on their own in mountains. And for such a more intensive practitioner, there's no fixed order of their practice. It can